This is the second time I'm going to make this video because the emergency alerts on the rain will interrupt even my phone when I'm videoing. Okay, and we got a lot of rain, and so we just stopped the video. Emergency alert, you got a flash flood warning. Look, you should not have the ability to bypass everything. Our local media, this is a different trend now, this is video too. Our local media, they have been running weather alerts on every one of the KIII, all of them, even for the past 2 weeks when there wasn't a weather alert. And I realized they get more hits. There were days where the weather alert was, there's nothing wrong today. So they realize they're trending. Oh look, a lot of people will click the link when they see that. But this has to do with media. Hopefully they won't interrupt this one. I want to get straight to the point. There's some national media that lie to you, and they know they lie. There are some of my websites and my video sites that will consider this video as hate speech because of talking and educating about issues. Yesterday, as a mainstream news, ABC, NBC, CBS, Googling their websites throughout the day, they had a breaking story. And the breaking story was Paul Manafort pleads guilty to conspiracy in the Russia collusion case. Okay. That was the headline. Paul Manafort pleads guilty to conspiracy having to do with Russia. I clicked the link, and that might have been NBC. This was either ABC, NBC, CBS, more than likely NBC. Now they know that that headline makes the general public believe that Mr. Manafort, who is being tried the second time and now he just made a plea deal, second case, it makes the public believe that he's admitting that as a former campaign chairman of Mr. Trump, that there was indeed conspiracy or collusion. Anybody that reads that headline would know that, except people that are aware of what fake news does. Now, when I clicked the link to their story on their site, it took you to another story on another news site, which was theirs, and it wasn't what they said in the headline. Now, initially, I thought maybe the Mueller team actually had Mr. Manafort plead guilty to something that maybe wasn't a crime. They did that with Michael Cohen, Trump's former lawyer. Okay? I covered that in the past. In order to influence everything that's going on. Mr. Manafort, what actually happened was, all the things they're investigating him for, one of the things that he did indeed do was he was a former lobbyist for a pro-Russian faction in Ukraine. For a former president of Ukraine, who was more pro-Russian than the United States wanted. This is going back a few years. Victor something. He was naturally democratically elected president of Ukraine that the Ukrainians themselves voted in. Ukraine, as a former satellite state of the Soviet Union, after the breakup of the USSR, became its own independent country. After the Soviet Russia broke up, all of these, Georgia and others, became their own independent states. Now, some were willing, more Russian ethnic people like Crimea liked Russia still and identified with the history of Russia, even the Orthodox Church of Russia. Now, when they voted Ukraine for a president democratically, they put somebody that was not as anti-Russia as the United States and the Western world wanted. Then what happened in the history of Ukraine was there was a coup. There was an uprising. And then Russia, along with the United States, kind of came to an agreement. Because there was a lot of uprising in Ukraine, that Russian president, Victor something, the Ukrainian president, he agreed to do early elections. You know what? We're going to have early elections. The United States and Russia and NATO and all, everybody said that sounds good to us. But then something happened. They had a coup, and they illegally overthrew a democratically elected president of Ukraine. And the U.S. immediately recognized the new illegal president of Ukraine. Isn't that amazing? John Kerry, Mr. Obama. And why did they do that? Because it was to the influence of the West, the United States, to have somebody else in there. Oh, and what did Mr. Putin think about that? He said, you guys are hypocrites. You claim to be pro-democracy, and you backed an illegal coup in Ukraine, which borders with Russia, of course. Which was also to the instability of Russia, because Russia has a military seaport off of the borders of Ukraine. But we did it because it was strategic. We did an unjust thing because it was strategically to our benefit. That's why we did that. Isn't that interesting? All right. Mr. Manafort, as sort of a lobbyist for many years, involved in many circles, he worked as a pro-lobbyist for this deposed president, Victor something, of Russia, which was legal to do. But then questions came up, were you registered properly as a lobbyist for a foreign country? Things that came up the last couple of years. So they kind of were going after Manafort on various things. Now he worked in order for you and for others in Washington to understand that there was indeed people that were pro-Russian, that were part of the Ukrainian country, and that also the man that Mr. Manafort was representing, this former Ukrainian president, it was almost really illegal what the U.S. did there, backing up that illegal coup, which Russia will tell you, Putin would tell you what I just told you, and even liberal media sites would tell you this. Okay, that's what they got Manafort to plead guilty to conspiracy with the Russians. Do you see how manipulative that is? And that a mainstream NBC, I think it was, actually reported that Mr. Manafort agreed to plead guilty to an illegal conspiracy with Russians. Now, I hope you understand how manipulative that is. That's what he pled guilty to. My actual lobbying work, I, Mr. Manafort, and my legal lobbying work for this former deposed Ukrainian president who was illegally deposed with the knowledge of the West, I plead guilty that that was a conspiracy with the Russians. MSNBC had their own legal analyst Friday night. His name is Danny Savalas. This is MSNBC, Joe Scarborough, that whole crowd, Chris Matthews. Their own legal analyst was on Friday night. I'm not sure which show it was. I read it, okay, on the news just today. And on the screen, I saw the screenshots. It had Russia, conspiracy, Russia. And it had all the cases in the last year, even Cohen and everything else. Russia conspiracy, Russia collusion, Trump, Russia collusion, guilty, 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 guilty. And then the Manafort one that I just explained. And their own legal analyst basically said, this is fake news in so many words. Their own MSNBC said, all of these screenshots, and now the Manafort collusion, guilty conspiracy, He basically said, as far as we know, it really has nothing to do with the Russian collusion of the Trump campaign with the Russian. And they know that. And my people, like my dear mom, whom sometimes I'll call on a Saturday. So the media, maybe 90% of the journalists who are now online today saying, we are not fake news, we are not fake news, we are not fake news, I don't think they realize that they are fake news. I guess a majority of them are probably not educated enough. Our local media is very uneducated because they have things on ads. We are real news and bloggers are fake news. And they don't even know what I just explained to you. They're not required to be educated about the world, about history, about philosophy, about God. They're just required, like the famous movie, The Legend of Ron Burgundy. What's that comedian's name? Will Ferrell. They said it was like a mock about journalism, but it seems to be true. And they said, just put anything in front of Ron Burgundy, that anchor man, and he'll read it. And so, at the same time, this is just one I can give you. This is just one I can give you. Even if their own legal analyst on MSNBC tries to say, we're manipulating the public, then they'll immediately shut them down or whatever. You can do the case after case after case after case. Fake news is basically running the narrative. I could have taught some good stuff. I'm listening to some of my CDs on the history of philosophy and educated men, courses I order. And he's talking about Karl Barth, who I've studied before, great theologian of the Christian church in the 1800s. But as this professor, of course I'm going through, he's talking about narrative. Now he's talking about it in the sense of modernity, philosophy, theology, but he's talking about a narrative. And what I'm trying to show you is narrative. Mr. Manafort pleaded guilty to conspiracy with Russia over something that many view as an illegal act that the United States themselves, under Mr. Obama and John Kerry, actually backed. Meaning, many analysts believe, even liberal ones, if you go to Truthdig or even people that have been on Democracy Now!, they have a professor, I forget his name, but he's out of New York City, a liberal man. In the last 2 years, he's been telling you part of what I just shared. He's an expert on Russia and Russian relations with the West. And he would tell you the same thing. I find it amazing. And Mr. Putin himself, he laid this case out before his people a few years ago. And he basically said to the U.S., you are hypocrites. He said, you just backed up an illegal coup from an actual democratically elected president of Ukraine. The U.S. agreed that they would have early elections, but then when that man was removed illegally, they installed another man. But that other man was somewhat of a fascist something, but he would be more anti-Russia than the previous man. So we just said, yes, and then Crimea, which was sort of like attached to Ukraine, which identified as a part of Ukraine after the breakup of the Soviet Union. They had their own election, and over 90% of the people in Crimea voted to go back to Russia, identify with Russia. And John Kerry and Mr. Obama said, that's an illegal annexation. And Mr. McCain, who passed away, said that's an illegal Russian aggression that they went and captured Crimea. And 90% of people said, we're going back to Russia. This is manipulation that you see. Okay? I figured I'd do that one. There's so many more because they do it nonstop. They do it nonstop. There's enough in the Mueller investigation now to realize that Mueller, the people that he has as prosecutors, Bruce Orr, which was one of the people that worked in the inside and was passing illegally the information after the FBI cut off contacts with Michael Steele, who was illegally getting Russian information because he was not registered as a foreign lobbyist, and he was getting Russian information, feeding it to the Democrats through Fusion GPS, so all collusion, handing that over to Mueller and his team behind the scenes. Meaning Mueller, the investigation, Rob Rosenstein, Mr. Weissman, one of the lead prosecutors with a very bad history, who's going after Trump now. They were all using illegal collusion information with the Russians. It's called the Russian dossier, in order to lie, manipulate, and justify things that they're doing right now. And then having Manafort pled guilty to this conspiracy with the Russians, even though he has all these other things, because he said, I did it for the sake of my wife and kids. Now, they're going to still put Manafort in prison for something that was simply lobbying for a former pro-Russian president that I just explained. And the media themselves, even their own legal analysts, are basically telling you, you are promoting a scam. The media is promoting a scam by the way they're covering these things. And it is their intent to manipulate you. They don't manipulate you by accident. They manipulate you on purpose. Okay? Okay, I'll end it with that. We have a lot of rain. Today is Saturday. This will be a real-time update. And it's also sad. That's where you see me posting now the new video sites, P-Cloud, back at the minute. This simple teaching to you in a non-political way, but to try to show you what's really happening. Some, Google and others, who came out this last week, how they openly admitted, Google openly admitted that they were using Google Analytics, Google and all of that, to manipulate the election for for Hillary Clinton, and to manipulate search rankings with Latino voters. And yet, collusion that takes place on the other side to openly, Mr. Obama is actually publicly now stated the last few days since he came out again, that the Benghazi thing, he says, and what a manipulation, they said something. People died. Ambassador Stevens died in Benghazi. And anyone that seriously looks at that whole thing, he died because of political things that Mrs. Clinton and the State Department did not want to give more security to Mr. Stevens and our embassy, which was the new embassy opened up in Benghazi, Libya, after the deposing of Mr. Gaddafi and his death, backed by the West. And Mr. Stevens and the embassy in Benghazi, they said, we better get some help. They're scoping out this place, they're going to attack us. And the only reason why Mrs. Clinton's State Department really did not send those extra security was because it would look bad politically on Mr. Obama. That's why they didn't send that extra security, and sure enough, Stevens was killed. And that's a political thing that I have a whole post on Benghazi. And then they went on, Susan Rice and others representing Mr. Obama and his administration went on the airwaves and said that was a result of an anti-Islamic video, that it wasn't a coordinated effort to attack that embassy. And the one thing that the media left out as they were reporting that, it happened on 9/11. Meaning, years later, it happened on 9/11. And all terrorists, most terrorists, if they're going to have an organized attack to kill Americans, they try to do it on 9/11. Tragically, but they tried to do it on 9/11, which we just passed 9/11 a few days ago. And none of the media, during that reporting, that the Benghazi thing was not organized, so Mr. Stevens and the text and emails released later was, they knew it, they reported to the State Department, Hillary Clinton, They said there's something going on. They're scoping out this place. And all of that information came out later. But yet Susan Rice and Obama's people went on national TV and said, oh, this was an anti-Islamic video. Why did they say that? It was false. It wasn't the result of an anti-Islamic video. They didn't want you, the public, to know that Libya was not working out well. Because Fareed Zakaria and CNN and everybody else said Obama's foreign policy, contrasted with Bush, is so unbelievably, they represented Mr. Obama as a genius, the likes of which the world has ever known. I remember MSNBC used to say, in one of their reportings, they said his IQ is so high. We've never had a human being with an IQ like Mr. Obama. And then the other guy said, and what do you think it is? He said, well, I don't know. They were covering. This was probably MSNBC. They said his IQ is so high, we've never had a man, a human being, with so people are fainting in. So you covered up, you don't reveal the truth about something tragically, like the Benghazi thing. And then Mr. Obama's out on the campaign trail this week, saying, and anybody that thinks of Benghazi, you're a conspiratorialist. You know, the blood of Stevens and U.S. people were there. How would Mr. Obama even begin to come back out and bring something like that into the public forum? That's a disgrace to the blood of those who died and to the administration of Mr. Obama, who went on TV and lied and said that was a video. It wasn't. It was a pre-planned thing, because it was 9/11 when the Benghazi attacks happened. And what does the media tell us about all this, John? They lie to you about all this. They lie constantly to you. Just like Mr. Manafort pled guilty to conspiracy with Russia, but they don't even spend 1 minute explaining what I just explained.